You can't do this. This is private property. I will have you arrested for this. Her voice was a screech, like metal shearing against metal. It echoed across the manicured lawns of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, a sound completely alien to this place of beige conformity and enforced quiet. I just stood there on my side of the property line, hands in my pockets, and watched the muddy water gurgle contently down the trench I had spent a week digging. It flowed out of my saturated land, across the useless swale she had demanded, and found its natural, gravitational path downhill. Right towards the shimmering, turquoise jewel of her community, the pool. It was already turning a sickening shade of brown. This whole mess started because I wanted peace. Funny how that works out, isn't it? If you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because you won't want to miss how this story of petty tyranny and engineered justice unfolds. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. The short version is this: my new neighbor, the president of the local HOA, built an illegal retention pond that flooded a barn full of my late wife's memories. She told me it was my problem to deal with. She was wrong. It was her problem. She just didn't know it yet. My name is Frank, and I'm a civil engineer. For 30 years, my life was about stress loads, soil composition, and ensuring that water went exactly where it was supposed to go. My wife, Eleanor, used to say I could see the world in blueprints. She was the artist, the one who saw the world in colors and light. When she passed away after a long illness, my world didn't just lose its color, it felt like the foundations had cracked straight through. The big house in the city, the one we'd raised our kids in, was suddenly just a collection of empty rooms filled with ghosts. I needed a project. I needed quiet. I found both in a 10-acre plot of land just outside the city limits. It had an old farmhouse that needed work and a magnificent, sturdy old barn. The property backed up against a newer, meticulously planned subdivision. Whispering Pines Estates. It looked pleasant enough from a distance. A sea of identical roofs and perfectly green lawns. My land was the opposite, a little wild, a little overgrown, and entirely my own. Eleanor had always dreamed of having a studio in a barn like this one. She wanted to fill it with light and canvases, to rescue old furniture and give it new life. Buying this place felt like finishing a conversation we'd never had. The barn wasn't just wood and nails to me, it was her unfulfilled dream, and I was going to be its caretaker. I spent the first 6 months just clearing it out, reinforcing the beams, and planning the huge windows she would have wanted. It was my therapy. It was my connection to her. The first sign of trouble came in a crisp white envelope, tucked into the railing of my front porch. It wasn't from the post office. It was hand-delivered, which felt oddly personal and a little presumptuous. The letterhead was embossed with a tasteful pine tree logo, Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. I wasn't in their HOA. My property was explicitly not part of the subdivision. I read the letter with a growing sense of confusion. It was a courtesy notice, informing me of upcoming construction on the edge of their property, adjacent to my own. They were installing a water management feature to enhance the aesthetic and environmental quality of the community. It sounded harmless enough. Vague, but harmless. I was a busy man, grieving and working on the barn. I filed the letter away and didn't give it a second thought. That was my first mistake. A week later, the bulldozers arrived. They scraped away a long section of earth right along my property line, a mere 15 feet from the corner of my barn. They dug a wide, shallow basin, about the size of a tennis court. It was a retention pond. I knew exactly what it was and what it was for. In theory, it collects storm runoff and allows it to percolate slowly back into the ground. In theory. I walked over to the foreman, a beefy guy with a sunburnt neck. "Morning," I said. "Frank Miller. This is my property." He grunted. "Yeah, we know. We got the stakes." "I'm a civil engineer," I told him. "Just curious, what's the design capacity on this thing? And what's your overflow plan?" He squinted at me, his expression turning sour. It was the look of a man who didn't like questions he couldn't answer. "We just build what's on the plans, pal. You got a problem, you talk to the HOA." Fair enough. I went back to my work, but with a knot of unease in my stomach. The design looked lazy. The grading was off. From where I stood, it looked like the lowest point of the entire basin was aimed directly at my barn. Water, I knew better than anyone, is relentless. It doesn't care about property lines or courtesy notices. It only cares about gravity. The day after the construction wrapped up, I met her. Brenda. She was walking the property line, clipboard in hand, inspecting the new pond. She had a severe haircut, expensive-looking athletic wear that had never seen a bead of sweat, and the kind of posture that suggested she was constantly smelling something unpleasant. "Can I help you?" I called out, walking over. She looked me up and down, a slow, dismissive appraisal. "You must be the new owner," it wasn't a question. "I'm Brenda, president of the Whispering Pines HOA. "Frank Miller," I said, offering a hand she made no move to shake. "I had a few questions about your new pond." "It's a bioswale," she corrected, the words dripping with condescension. "A state-of-the-art solution for storm runoff. It adds significant value to our community." "It looks like a retention pond," I said, keeping my tone level. "And it also looks like you've created a drainage issue. Your overflow is pointed directly at my barn." She gave a brittle little laugh. "That's impossible. Our engineers are the best in the business. The design is flawless." "I'm an engineer," I repeated. "And I can tell you, just by looking at the grade, that you're going to have a problem right here." I pointed to the corner of my barn. "When this thing fills up, that's where the water is going to go." Her smile was gone, replaced by a tight, angry line. "Our property is designed to manage our water. If you have a drainage problem on your property, I suggest you hire an engineer of your own." "Oh, wait," she smirked. "I suppose you think you know better." The conversation was over before it began. She turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me standing there with the distinct feeling that I hadn't just met a neighbor, I had met an adversary. The first real test came 3 weeks later. A summer thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that dumps a month's worth of rain in a single afternoon. I stood at the window in my kitchen, watching the so-called bioswale fill up. It happened fast. The water sheeted off the endless pavement and rooftops of Whispering Pines and poured into the basin. Just as I had predicted, it filled to the brim. And then it kept coming. A muddy tongue of water spilled over the edge and began to creep, slowly but surely, toward my barn. It lapped at the foundation, soaking the old wood. The storm passed, and the water receded, but it left a dark, ugly stain on the foundation. Inside, the floor was damp. I took photos. I documented everything. I wrote a polite, professional letter to the HOA board, care of Brenda. I explained the situation in simple, engineering terms. I included the photos. I proposed a simple solution, a small berm and a French drain on their side of the property line to divert the overflow. It was a cheap, easy fix. The response came a week later. It wasn't a letter. It was a fine. $100 for an unapproved structure on my property. The structure in question: a stack of old pallets I had next to the barn, waiting to be hauled away. The letter, signed by Brenda, also stated that my claims of water damage were unfounded, and that any water on my property was a result of my own poor landscaping and deferred maintenance. I was stunned. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a declaration of war. She wasn't just ignoring the problem, she was punishing me for pointing it out. The fine felt like a slap in the face, a deliberate act of intimidation. I drove to the community management office the next day, fine in hand. Brenda was there, holding court with 2 other board members. She saw me walk in and her face hardened. "Mr. Miller," she said loudly, for the benefit of her audience. "If you're here to contest your citation, the appeals process is clearly outlined in the letter you received." "I'm not here about the fine, Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Though it is a nice touch. I'm here about the water. You have a serious design flaw in your retention pond, and it's damaging my property." "We have already addressed this," she snapped. "The issue is your property, not ours. Perhaps if you spent less time stacking trash," she gestured at the fine, "and more time on proper upkeep, you wouldn't have these problems." The 2 other board members shifted uncomfortably. They wouldn't meet my eye. It was clear who was in charge. "This isn't going to go away," I said. "This is a liability issue. A big one. All it's going to take is one major storm, and you'll have done tens of thousands of dollars in damage to my barn. And you will be liable. Her eyes narrowed into slits. Are you threatening me, Mr. Miller? I'm stating a fact, I said. I'm a civil engineer. This is what I do for a living. I am telling you, with professional certainty, that you have created a hazard. And I am telling you, she said, her voice rising, that the Whispering Pines HOA will not be bullied. You are on private property. Please leave. I left. But as I walked back to my truck, the frustration boiling in my gut was starting to cool into something else. Something hard and cold. Resolve. She thought she could bully me, fine me, and condescend her way out of this. She was using the HOA's rules as a weapon. It was time to start reading those rules myself. And not just the HOA's rules. I was going to read the county's rules. The state's rules. I was going to pull every permit, every blueprint, every survey map related to Whispering Pines. She wanted to play by the book. Fine. I was about to show her what it felt like to be crushed by the whole library. The harassment escalated, just as I knew it would. After our confrontation, Brenda seemed to make it her personal mission. I started getting weekly, courtesy notices about the length of my grass near the property line. A notice about visual nuisance because my work truck, parked 100 yards from her precious subdivision, was visible from one of the houses. Another fine arrived, this time for unauthorized commercial activity because I was, and I quote, operating a construction business from my property. I was renovating my own barn. She was a petty tyrant, drunk on the thimbleful of power her little HOA kingdom afforded her. She was also making a critical mistake. She was creating a paper trail. Every ridiculous fine, every baseless accusation, was another document I carefully filed away. It was a catalogue of her harassment, a testament to her vendetta. I tried to mitigate the water damage myself. I bought sandbags and stacked them along the barn's foundation before every predicted rainfall. I started digging a shallow ditch on my own property to try and divert the inevitable overflow. The moment my shovel hit the dirt, another notice appeared on my porch. A cease and desist letter, drafted by the HOA's lawyer, claiming my unapproved excavation was a violation of county grading ordinances and threatening legal action. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. The neighbors in the subdivision were a mixed bag. A few would give me a hesitant wave if they saw me outside. Most just stared, their faces blank. They knew what was happening. I could see it in their eyes. They were afraid of Brenda. They had seen what she did to people who crossed her, people who painted their front door the wrong shade of beige or left their trash cans out for an hour too long. I was the outsider, the nail that stuck up, and she was hammering me down to make an example for the rest of them. Then came the storm. It wasn't just a thunderstorm. The weather forecasters called it a 100-year rain event. It was a tropical depression that had crawled inland and stalled out right over us. For 2 days, the sky opened up. The rain didn't fall, it came down in solid, opaque sheets. It was a deluge of biblical proportions. I did what I could. I checked my sandbags, dug my trench a little deeper, and hoped for the best. But there's no fighting that much water. On the second night, I was woken by a sound like a freight train. I went to the back door and my blood ran cold. The retention pond was gone. It was just part of a massive, churning brown lake that had swallowed the entire back end of the Whispering Pines development and was now consuming my property. The water wasn't just lapping at the barn anymore. It was halfway up the walls. There was nothing I could do but watch, helpless, as the foundation I had so carefully repaired was submerged. The water poured through the old wooden siding, carrying with it the mud and debris from Brenda's glorious bioswale. When the rain finally stopped and the sun came out the next morning, the devastation was absolute. The water receded over the next day, leaving behind a thick, stinking layer of mud over everything. I put on my rubber boots and waded toward the barn. The smell of mildew and rot hit me from 20 feet away. I pushed open the heavy door. The scene inside broke my heart. Everything on the floor was ruined. My tools were already starting to rust. But that wasn't the worst of it. Stored carefully on a low shelf were several boxes of Eleanor's things. Her sketchbooks, filled with drawings of projects she'd wanted to tackle. A box of her favorite art books, their pages now swollen and warped into unrecognizable pulp. And a wooden chest containing the antique furniture she had been collecting for years, waiting to be refinished. It was all saturated, mud-caked, and destroyed. The water line was 3 feet up the wall. The wood was stained and starting to warp. The foundation, the part I'd spent months working on, was severely compromised. Years of Eleanor's dreams, and months of my own grief-fueled labor, had been washed away by mud and arrogance. That was it. That was the moment. The turning point. The peace I had come here seeking was a joke. My attempts at reason, at polite negotiation, had been met with contempt and aggression. My wife's memory had been desecrated. Standing there, surrounded by the wreckage, I didn't feel anger anymore. That emotion was too hot, too messy. What I felt was a cold, clear, and absolute certainty. A focus I hadn't felt since my wife passed. Brenda had made this personal. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had flooded my barn, but in doing so, she had also ignited something within me. I was no longer just a grieving husband trying to build a memorial. I was a civil engineer. And I was going to introduce Brenda to the unyielding, unforgiving laws of physics and litigation. She had started a war over water. I was going to end it with a flood of my own. The investigation began that afternoon. I traded my work boots for my desk chair. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest, but now it had a purpose. It was fuel. I started where any good engineer would, with the plans. I drove down to the county records office. It's amazing what you can find in public records if you know how and where to look. I requested the full development plans for the Whispering Pines Estates, Phase 4, the section that bordered my property. I wanted every survey, every grading plan, every permit application and approval. The clerk, a woman named Carol with a mountain of gray hair and a kind smile, seemed to sense I was on a mission. "Big stack of papers you got there," she commented as she wheeled a cart laden with document binders to my table. "Just a little light reading," I said. I spent the next 8 hours hunched over that table, my coffee growing cold beside me. I analyzed drainage calculations. I cross-referenced topographical maps with the approved construction blueprints. I read the fine print on every single permit. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. The first discrepancy was small, but significant. The original plans, the ones approved by the County Planning Commission, showed a series of small, interconnected swales distributed throughout the development's green spaces. A sensible, low-impact design. The single large retention pond that they actually built was nowhere in the approved plans. Interesting. I dug deeper. I found the application for the pond. It was filed as an amendment to the original plan. It had been fast-tracked, pushed through with a minimum of oversight. The engineering specs were thin, almost laughably simplistic. The application was signed by Brenda, as HOA president. The engineering firm listed on the document was a company I'd never heard of, Pinnacle Construction Solutions. My phone was already in my hand. A quick search for Pinnacle Construction Solutions turned up a bare-bones website and a registered business address that was a P.O. box in the next town over. Another search, this time in the state's business registry, gave me the name of the company's owner. Darren Vance. The name meant nothing to me. But on a hunch, I did one more search. I searched for Brenda's last name online, looking for public social media profiles, news articles, anything. I found her campaign announcement from when she was first elected HOA president. It included a smiling photo of her with her supportive family. Her husband, her 2 kids, and her brother. Her brother's name was Darren Vance. A cold, jagged smile spread across my face. It felt alien on my own skin. This wasn't just incompetence anymore. This was a classic small-time grift. Brenda had used her position to bypass the approved plans and award a no-bid contract to her brother to build an inferior, cheaper, and ultimately dangerous retention pond. They likely charged the HOA a premium price for a shoddy job, and pocketed the difference. The flooding, the damage, my ruined barn, it wasn't just a consequence of her arrogance, but a direct result of her greed. This was the weakness. This was the crack in her foundation. Her belief that she was untouchable, that no one would ever bother to check the paperwork, was about to become her undoing. I made copies of everything. The original approved plans, the hastily filed amendment, the business registration for Pinnacle Construction Solutions, the article with the family photo. I walked out of the records office with a thick file folder that felt as heavy and powerful as a weapon. The next step was documenting my own side of the story. I hired a professional structural engineer to assess the damage to the barn and a water damage restoration company to give me a formal quote for the repairs. The numbers were staggering. The structural damage alone was in the high five figures. The cost to remediate the mold and repair the interior was even more. And that didn't even account for the irreplaceable personal items that were lost forever. I set up several trail cameras on my property, concealed in trees, all pointed toward the property line and the retention pond. If Brenda or any of her cronies set foot on my land, I would have them on video. Every interaction from this point forward would be recorded. My grief had a new shape. It was no longer a passive, crushing weight. It was a whetstone. And I was sharpening my resolve against it until it had a razor's edge. Brenda thought this was a battle of wills, a neighborhood squabble. She had no idea. I wasn't fighting her. I was building a case. And like any good engineering project, it would be methodical, precise, and devastatingly effective. The plan began to form in my mind, a blueprint for justice. I called it Project Watershed. It had 2 phases. Phase 1 was the trap. Phase 2 was the flood. Phase 1 required me to be patient, to let Brenda think she was winning. I sent a formal, certified letter to the HOA board. I laid out the facts in cold, emotionless detail. I cited the specific county codes their pond violated. I attached the damage assessments from the structural engineer and the restoration company, totaling over $150,000. I formally requested that the HOA immediately present a plan to rectify the illegal drainage system and compensate me for the damages. I gave them 30 days to respond. This wasn't a plea. It was a legal maneuver. I knew Brenda would never agree. Her ego wouldn't allow it, and admitting fault would open the door to questions about the pond's construction that she absolutely could not afford to answer. Her predictable, arrogant refusal would be a crucial piece of evidence. It would prove that the HOA was made aware of the hazard and willfully chose to ignore it. While I waited for her response, I began preparations for Phase 2. I went to a landscaping supply company and bought several hundred feet of heavy-duty corrugated drain pipe, the wide, 12-inch diameter kind. I also bought connectors, grates, and a dozen bags of gravel. My unauthorized commercial activity was about to get a whole lot more active. My property had a natural slope to it. It ran downhill from the barn, across a small pasture, and toward the front of my property near the road. Coincidentally, the land on the other side of the road, directly across from my driveway, was the low point for the whole area. It was the location of the Whispering Pines Community Center, with its pristine tennis courts, its perfectly manicured event lawn, and its sparkling blue swimming pool. The county's own topographical maps confirmed it. If a massive amount of water were to be, say, diverted from my barn and channeled efficiently, its natural destination, according to the laws of physics and gravity, would be Brenda's beloved community hub. I started digging. I worked in the evenings, after the sun went down, using the headlights of my truck for illumination. I dug a long, deep trench, starting from the lowest point near the barn's foundation. It ran the length of my pasture, a gentle, perfectly calculated slope. It was hard work, but every shovelful of dirt felt like a small victory. I was no longer a victim of the water, I was controlling it. I was bending it to my will. The HOA's response arrived on day 29. It was exactly what I expected. A letter from their high-priced lawyer, dripping with legalese and dismissive threats. It stated that the HOA rejected my frivolous and unsubstantiated claims, it accused me of attempting to extort the association, and it contained a threat of its own, a countersuit for harassment and for the illegal and unpermitted earthworks I was currently engaged in. I laughed out loud when I read it. She was digging her own grave deeper with every word. I filed the letter neatly in my growing binder of evidence. Phase 1 was complete. The trap was set. There was an HOA monthly meeting scheduled for the following week. It was listed on the community bulletin board by the entrance to the subdivision. Normally, it was a sleep-inducing affair where residents argued about petunias and parking spaces. But the recent flooding had people spooked. The agenda listed stormwater management discussion as the main topic. It was the perfect venue. I put on a clean shirt and a sports coat, the first time I'd worn one since Eleanor's funeral. I grabbed my file folder, which was now nearly 3 inches thick. I was not an official member of the HOA, but the meeting was technically open to the public, and as an adjacent property owner directly affected by their stormwater management, I had every right to be there. The meeting was held in the community center's clubhouse. The air was thick with cheap coffee and anxiety. About 30 residents were scattered in folding chairs. Brenda sat at the head table with the other 4 board members, looking imperious. She saw me walk in, and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with a saccharine smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's call this meeting to order," she began. She breezed through the minutes and the treasurer's report. Then she got to the main event. "As you all know," she said, her voice full of false sympathy, "we recently experienced an unprecedented weather event. Our state-of-the-art bioswale performed admirably under extreme stress, but unfortunately, some minor overflow was unavoidable." A man in the front row raised his hand. "Minor. Brenda, the entire back greenbelt was a lake. My kid's playground is still a mud pit." Brenda's smile tightened. "Yes, well, as I said, it was a 100-year storm. We are already consulting with our engineers about potential upgrades. But these things are expensive, and may require a special assessment." Murmurs of discontent rippled through the room. A special assessment meant everyone's dues would go up. This was my opening. I stood up. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm and clear. "My name is Frank Miller. I'm the owner of the property adjacent to your new pond. And I can tell you exactly why it failed." All eyes turned to me. Brenda's face went from annoyed to furious in a heartbeat. "This is a private meeting for residents only," she snapped. "Actually," I said, holding up a copy of their own bylaws, which I had downloaded from their website, Section 5, Article 3 states that meetings are open to the public, and non-residents may be granted the floor at the discretion of the board to discuss matters of mutual interest. And I believe $150,000 in property damage qualifies as a matter of mutual interest. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner. One of the other board members, a nervous-looking man named George, cleared his throat. I think we should hear him out, Brenda." Brenda shot him a look that could curdle milk, but she was trapped. "Fine," she hissed. "You have 2 minutes." "I won't need that long," I said. I walked to the front of the room. "You're right about one thing, Brenda. You do need to consult with engineers. Because the ones you hired to build this pond are either incompetent or criminally negligent." I held up the first document. "This is the county-approved drainage plan for your development. It specifies a series of interconnected swales. It was approved because it was a sound design." Then I held up the second document. "And this is the amendment you filed for a single retention pond, a design that was never subjected to a proper hydrological study. It was rubber-stamped. I wonder why. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that the construction company you hired, Pinnacle Construction Solutions, is owned by your brother, Darren Vance." A collective gasp went through the room. Brenda's face went white as a sheet. "This is an outrage," she sputtered. "These are lies. Slander." "Are they?" I asked, my voice still level. "Is this a lie?" I held up the printout of the family photo. "And is it a lie that this pond was built in direct violation of County Code 11A, which specifies minimum setbacks from adjacent property structures? Your pond is 10 feet too close to my barn. It is, by legal definition, an illegal structure." I let that hang in the air for a moment. The flooding wasn't an act of God. It was a failure of design and a failure of oversight. Your bioswale isn't a community asset. It's a liability, and a monument to a shady backroom deal. I turned to the residents. "She's talking about a special assessment to fix her brother's shoddy, illegal work. The question you should be asking isn't how much more you'll have to pay. It's where all the money went in the first place." I laid the file on the table in front of the board. "My property sustained over $150,000 in damages. This is your one and only chance to do the right thing. Fix the pond, and pay for the damages you caused." My lawyer is waiting for your call." Then I turned and walked out of the room, leaving a firestorm of shouting and accusations in my wake. The trap had been sprung. Brenda's carefully constructed world of control and authority was cracking. But I knew her. She wouldn't fold. She would lash out. And I was ready for that, too. Phase 2 was coming. All it needed was a little rain. Brenda's reaction was even more vicious than I had anticipated. She was a cornered animal, and she came out snarling. The official HOA response was silence. My lawyer's calls went unanswered. But the unofficial response began almost immediately. The first salvo was a smear campaign. Anonymous, cheaply photocopied flyers appeared on every lamppost in Whispering Pines. They had my photo on them, a grainy shot probably taken with a telephoto lens while I was working in my yard. The headline read, "Dangerous Neighbor Alert." The text was a work of paranoid fiction. It painted me as an unstable, litigious recluse who was trying to destroy our community values and extort money from hard-working families. It mentioned my unpermitted construction and hinted that I was a threat to the safety of their children. It was vile, cowardly, and utterly predictable. Next, she weaponized the county bureaucracy. I started getting visits. A man from code enforcement showed up to inspect my illegal trenching, citing an anonymous complaint. I calmly showed him my property survey and the county ordinances, which clearly stated I was well within my rights to install drainage on my own land. He left, looking embarrassed. A sheriff's deputy arrived a few days later, responding to a call about suspicious activity. I had a pleasant chat with him on my porch, explained the situation with the HOA, and he left shaking his head. Brenda even tried to get a temporary restraining order against me, claiming I had threatened and harassed her. The judge took one look at her flimsy, hysterical petition and my meticulously documented file of her own harassment and threw it out of court in less than 5 minutes. Each attempt to hurt me was a failure that only made my legal case stronger. My cameras caught the HOA's landscaping crew trespassing on my property to remove my survey stakes. More evidence for the file. But her campaign was having an effect. The few friendly waves from neighbors stopped. When I drove past the subdivision entrance, I saw people whisper and point. They were scared. I was the boogeyman Brenda had created to distract from her own corruption. I was isolated, which was exactly what she wanted. She had made a critical miscalculation, however. She thought isolating me would make me weak. She didn't understand that I had been isolated by grief for the better part of a year. I was comfortable in the quiet. It gave me time to think. It gave me time to work. The trench was finished. The drainpipe was laid in a bed of gravel, connected, and covered over. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, invisible now, but ready. A silent, patient solution waiting for a problem. The final piece of the puzzle came from a place I never expected. I received an email from an anonymous, encrypted address. The subject line was simply, Pinnacle Construction. The email was short. "You're right about Brenda and her brother. It's worse than you think. I have proof. I can't meet in person. Leave a disposable phone in the mailbox at the end of your driveway tomorrow morning. I'll contact you." It was a risk. It could be a trap. But my gut told me it was real. This was the whistleblower. This was the person on the inside who had finally had enough. I bought a cheap burner phone and left it in the mailbox as instructed. It sat there all day. I was beginning to think I'd been had. Then, just after dusk, it rang. The voice on the other end was quiet, nervous. It was a man. "Is this Frank Miller?" "It is." "Who is this?" "My name is Arthur," he said. I was the treasurer for the Whispering Pines HOA. I resigned last week. It was the nervous-looking man from the board meeting. "George's friend." "I saw what you did at the meeting," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "You have no idea. She's been running this place like her own personal piggy bank for years." The pond was just the most blatant example. "What can you tell me, Arthur?" I asked. "I have copies of the real invoices from her brother's company. And copies of the checks the HOA paid. But that's not the half of it. I have the bank statements. The ones she didn't think I'd see. She had her brother's company kick back almost 40% of the project cost directly to a private LLC she controls. It's not just a conflict of interest. It's felony embezzlement. We're talking about nearly $80,000. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. The smoking gun. This went far beyond a civil dispute. This was a criminal case. Why are you telling me this? I asked him. Because I have a conscience, he said, his voice cracking. And because she threatened me. After that meeting, she told me if I didn't back her up, she'd find a way to make the financial irregularities look like my fault. She'd ruin me. I'm not a brave man, Mr. Miller, but I'm not going to be your scapegoat. Can you get me the documents? They're on a flash drive, he said. I'll leave it in the same mailbox tomorrow morning. After that, you can't contact me. I'm taking my family to visit relatives out of state for a while. Just get her, Mr. Miller. For all of us. The line went dead. The next morning, the flash drive was there. It contained everything Arthur had promised. Scanned copies of the inflated invoices, the HOA checks, and the damning bank statements showing the kickbacks to Brenda's shell company. It was a prosecutor's dream. My next call wasn't to my civil lawyer. It was to an old friend from college, a guy named Dave who was now a senior investigator in the district attorney's white-collar crime division. I met him for coffee and laid out the entire story, from the first notice to the flash drive from Arthur. He listened patiently, his expression growing more and more grim. When I was finished, he picked up the flash drive. Frank, he said, this is clean. It's simple, it's greedy, and it's beautifully documented. People like this, these little tin-pot dictators, they think the rules don't apply to them. They get so used to bullying people over lawn ornaments that they think they can get away with grand larceny. He stood up. Let me take this back to the office. We'll verify everything, but it looks solid. We're going to need you to be patient. An investigation takes time. We have to build an airtight case. Don't do anything to tip her off. Just sit tight and let her think she's won. I can do that, I said. But Dave, there's a storm front moving in. The forecast says it's going to be a big one, hitting us late next week. Dave smiled. Well then. It sounds like things might get a little messy for Brenda before we even get involved. The week crawled by. On the surface, I did nothing. I stopped my work. I let the anonymous flyers stay on the lampposts. To Brenda and the rest of Whispering Pines, it must have looked like I had given up, that her campaign of intimidation had worked. I could feel her smug satisfaction radiating from across the property line. But I was busy. I was checking the weather forecast every hour. The storm was coming. A massive low-pressure system that the meteorologists were gleefully calling a super soaker, it was predicted to dump 5 to 7 inches of rain in a 12-hour period. It would be more than enough. The day before the storm was due, the HOA sent out an email blast. An emergency community meeting was scheduled for the day after the storm. The topic, a vote on a critical, one-time special assessment of $5,000 per household to fund a permanent stormwater drainage solution and mitigate future flooding. The gall of it was breathtaking. She was going to use the impending storm as a scare tactic to panic the residents into giving her more money to cover up her crime. It was the perfect stage for the final act. I forwarded the email to Dave at the DA's office. His reply was a single word, perfect. The night the storm hit, I sat on my covered porch and watched. The rain started just after sunset, a gentle patter that soon became a roar. The wind howled. I walked out to the edge of my property with a high-powered flashlight. Brenda's pond was filling up, just as it had before. The water poured in, a muddy torrent from the streets and gutters of her subdivision. It rose higher and higher, a ticking time bomb of her own making. Then, it happened. The water crested the edge of the pond and spilled over onto my land. But this time, it was not an uncontrolled flood. This time, it was met by my design. The overflow poured directly into the mouth of my hidden drainage system. The large grate, covered with a thin layer of sod, took it all in. I could hear the water rushing through the huge pipe buried beneath my feet. It was the sound of victory. My barn stayed bone dry. I walked to the front of my property, to the end of the trench. The water shot out of the culvert under my driveway with incredible force, a man-made river. It crossed the road and flowed onto the Whispering Pines common property. It followed the path of least resistance, the one dictated by the topography of the land itself. It flowed directly onto the pristine event lawn, turning it into a swamp. It filled the sand traps of the tennis courts. And then, it poured, in a beautiful, muddy waterfall, into the crystal-clear, azure water of the community swimming pool. Project Watershed was a complete success. The emergency meeting was chaos from the moment it started. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. The mood was not anxious this time, it was furious. Everyone had seen the pool. It looked like a giant bowl of chocolate milk, filled with debris and lawn furniture. Brenda stood at the podium, her face pale but her expression defiant. "I know everyone is upset about the pool," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured rage. "But this is not the fault of the HOA. This is a deliberate act of sabotage and vandalism by one individual." She pointed a shaking finger at me as I stood in the back of the room. "Frank Miller. He illegally diverted water onto our property and destroyed our community assets. He will pay for this." The crowd turned on me, a wave of angry faces. "Is that true?" someone shouted. "Did you flood our pool?" I held up my hands, calm in the eye of the hurricane. "Yes," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "I did divert the water. The water that was flooding my property from your illegal retention pond. The same pond that already caused $150,000 of damage to my barn. The same pond you were warned about, in writing, and refused to fix." "Lies!" Brenda shrieked. "He's a liar." "Am I?" I said, walking slowly toward the front. "Let's talk about what's real. Is it real that you're asking these people for $5,000 each? $250,000 in total. Is it to fix the drainage? Or is it to cover your tracks?" I looked out at the angry, confused faces of the residents. Brenda doesn't want to fix the problem. She wants to bury the evidence. The evidence that this pond was an illegal, non-permitted structure. The evidence that it was built by her brother's company in a clear case of nepotism. And the evidence, I said, my voice dropping for emphasis, that nearly $80,000 of the money you all paid for that pond was kicked back directly into a shell corporation owned by Brenda herself. The room exploded. People were shouting, screaming at Brenda, who looked like she had been struck by lightning. "Prove it," she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. "You can't prove any of it." "Actually," a calm voice said from the side of the room. "We can." Two men and a woman who had been sitting quietly in the back row stood up. They opened their jackets to reveal badges. "District Attorney's Office," Dave said, his voice carrying easily over the din. "Brenda Vance, you are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy." The color drained from Brenda's face. She looked like a ghost. She stared at them, then at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The residents fell into a stunned silence, their anger replaced by shock. As a uniformed officer who had been waiting outside came in to put her in handcuffs, her eyes locked on mine. The fury returned, a final, desperate spark. "You'll regret this," she screeched, her voice raw and ugly as they led her away. "I'll sue you for everything you have. I'll own that barn." It was the last, impotent threat of a fallen tyrant. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The aftermath was swift and decisive. With Brenda gone and the evidence of her corruption laid bare, the Whispering Pines HOA collapsed like a house of cards. The remaining board members resigned in disgrace. The story hit the local news, a satisfying little tale of small-town corruption and comeuppance. An emergency election was held, and a new board was voted in. They were reasonable people, homeowners who had been cowed by Brenda's reign of terror and were now determined to set things right. Their first official act was to come to my house. The new president, the men who had questioned Brenda at the first meeting, came to my door, hat in hand. He apologized. Profusely. On behalf of the entire community. He said they were ashamed of how I had been treated and horrified by Brenda's actions. He then handed me a check. It was an initial payment from the HOA's reserve funds to begin the repairs on my barn, with a legally binding agreement to pay the rest in installments. They didn't just offer money. They offered partnership. They hired the structural engineering firm I recommended to not only oversee the repairs on my barn but to design a proper, legal, and effective drainage solution for the entire community. My trench and pipe system became the basis for the new design. I was paid a handsome consulting fee for my work. Brenda's fate was a textbook example of justice. Faced with the mountain of evidence Arthur and I had provided, she took a plea deal. She was sentenced to 3 years in state prison. She was forced to pay back every cent she had stolen, which bankrupted her. Her husband divorced her. Her house went into foreclosure. She lost everything. Her brother's company was dissolved, and he faced his own legal troubles. The community began to heal. The ugly, illegal pond was removed, replaced by the series of gentle, effective swales that should have been there all along. The pool was drained, cleaned, and refilled. The flyers with my face on them came down. The fearful stares were replaced with nods of respect, and even a few waves of genuine friendship. I was no longer the boogeyman, I was the guy who had Lance the Boil. I spent the next year restoring the barn. But this time, it wasn't a solitary act of grief. Neighbors from Whispering Pines would often stop by, offering to help hold a board or fetch a tool. Arthur, the former treasurer, moved back and became a good friend. We'd sometimes sit on my porch, drinking iced tea and watching the sunset over the now peaceful property line. The barn became more beautiful than I had ever imagined. The new windows let in streams of afternoon light. The floors were solid, the walls clean. I left one of the original, water-stained boards exposed on an interior wall, a reminder of what had happened. A reminder not to mistake kindness for weakness. In the end, I found the peace I was looking for. It wasn't the quiet, solitary peace I had expected. It was a different kind, a better kind. It was the peace that comes from standing up for what's right, from protecting the things you love. It was the peace of a community reborn, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that a bully had finally faced the consequences of her actions. My wife, Eleanor, would have liked that. I think she would have been proud. It just goes to show you that sometimes, the most complex problems of engineering, and of people, can be solved by a simple application of gravity. You just have to make sure you're directing the flow. What's the most ridiculous rule or abuse of power you've ever seen from an HOA or a similar organization? Let me know your stories in the comments below. It's important to remember that for every bully like Brenda, there are communities full of good people who just need someone to show them that they don't have to be afraid. Thanks for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, please remember to hit that subscribe button, because I have a feeling there are a lot more stories out there just waiting to be told. You never know when you'll need a blueprint for justice.